Have you ever had a dream so vivid that, upon waking up, you weren't sure if it was real or not? Many of us have experienced this. In those moments, everything feels absolutely real. Yet as soon as we wake up, we ask ourselves, was it all just a dream? But what about now? How can we be certain that the world we're experiencing at this moment is truly real? This question isn't new. The French philosopher René Descartes pondered the same thing centuries ago. Today, science has shown that when we see something in real life and when we imagine it, very similar neural activities occur in our brains. If our brain processes dreams and reality in such a similar way, how do we distinguish one from the other? In this video, we'll explore the complex relationship between imagination and reality in the human mind. How does our brain distinguish between imagination and reality? Imagine standing by your window and picturing an alien dancing in the middle of the street. Sounds fun, right? In your mind, this alien can perform all sorts of dance moves, interact with objects around it, and move just like a real being. Yet despite how vividly you can picture this scene, you know the alien is just a product of your imagination. But how is that possible? As you visualize the dancing extraterrestrial in front of you, it might seem as real as anything else in your surroundings. And yet, you have no doubt that the street lamp and the road are real, while the alien is not. This brings us to a fascinating question. How do we determine what is real and what is merely imagined? It's not hard to picture this. An alien dancing in the middle of the street. When you imagine it, you can vividly see its movements and how it interacts with its surroundings. But here's the question. Why is the street lamp real to us, while the dancing alien is just a product of our imagination? You might say, because aliens don't exist. But that answer doesn't quite explain it. Imagine a mother cat with 5 kittens, even though no cats are actually present on the street. You would still recognize that the cats exist only in your mind. The brain processes visual information by assessing it against a threshold. If the incoming signals surpass this threshold, the brain categorizes them as real. If they fall short, the brain labels them as imaginary. Most of the time, this system works reliably because the signals generated by imagination tend to be weak. However, sometimes this boundary can be crossed. If an imagined scene produces signals strong enough to exceed the brain's threshold, it may be perceived as real. This can lead to hallucinations or difficulty distinguishing between reality and fantasy. Can our perceptions and imagination get mixed up? Have you ever imagined something so vividly that it felt almost real? This phenomenon is known as the Perky effect. Discovered by Mary Chaves West Perky in 1910, it suggests that our ability to distinguish between reality and imagination is not as foolproof as we might think. In her experiment, Perky asked participants to stare at a blank wall and imagine specific objects. Meanwhile, without their knowledge, she projected faint images of those objects onto the wall. The surprising result? Participants believed they were simply imagining the objects, but they also reported that their mental images looked unusually vivid. Some even said, "If I didn't know I was imagining this, I would think it was real." In the 1970s, psychologist Sidney Jolson Siegel revisited Perky's experiment with a twist. He asked participants to visualize the skyline of New York City while looking at a blank wall. At the same time, he projected a very faint image of a tomato onto the wall. The result? Many participants described seeing a sunset-lit silhouette of New York City, when in reality, only a blurry tomato was present. These findings suggest that our brains don't simply process what we see, they also incorporate our expectations into our perception. This can sometimes cause us to perceive things that don't actually exist. However, later attempts to replicate Perky's findings were inconsistent. As a result, scientists began developing new theories about how we distinguish between reality and imagination. Is the boundary between reality and imagination really that clear? Our brains may use the same neural networks to process both imagined and real perceptions. However, distinguishing the differences between these networks is a challenge. Functional magnetic resonance imaging helps measure brain activity, but its resolution is not yet advanced enough to pinpoint these distinctions. Each pixel in an fMRI scan contains around 1,000 neurons, making it nearly impossible to differentiate them individually. Some studies suggest that imagined experiences are encoded in a more superficial layer of the visual cortex compared to real experiences. The visual cortex, or occipital lobe, located at the back of the brain, processes both the images we see and those we imagine. This could indicate the presence of a biological mechanism that helps the brain differentiate between real and imagined images. To explore these boundaries, researchers conducted a fascinating experiment during the COVID-19 pandemic. A group of 400 participants was asked to stare at stationary lines and imagine them tilting left or right. They then rated how realistic this experience felt on a scale from 1 to 5. Here's the twist. Without informing the participants, the researchers actually altered the lines, physically tilting them. When asked whether what they saw was real or imagined, researchers expected participants to experience the perky effect, meaning they would assume the change was just a product of their imagination. Surprisingly, most participants identified the change as real. These results suggest that while our brains sometimes struggle to separate imagination from reality, a strong enough external signal is usually perceived as real. But what determines when an imagined image feels real? Scientists still don't have a definitive answer. However, neurotransmitters, changes in neural connections, or entirely different biological mechanisms could play a role. The quest to understand where the boundary between reality and imagination lies continues. Are we perceiving the world differently than our ancestors? Can we truly trust our eyes? We tend to believe what we see, yet vision is one of the easiest senses to manipulate. For instance, when looking at an optical illusion, you might think a static shape is moving. In reality, it's completely still, but your brain interprets the visual cues differently, creating the illusion of motion. The invention of television was a turning point in human perception of reality. As technology advanced, we became exposed to an overwhelming amount of visual stimuli, lowering our threshold for distinguishing real from fake. For someone living in the 1900s, the boundary between imagination and reality was far clearer because their visual experiences were more limited. However, for those growing up in the digital age, this distinction is becoming increasingly blurred. Today, the line between reality and imagination fades a little more each day. But how our brains will adapt to this shift and what it means for the future of human perception remains an open question. As we've seen, the boundary between perception and imagination is becoming increasingly blurred. With the rise of virtual reality, augmented reality, and AI-driven content, we're now able to step into worlds that challenge our understanding of what's real. Our individual experiences are shaped not only by our brains, but also by the growing influence of technology and media. Deepfake videos, fake news, and social media filters are all examples of how our collective reality is being manipulated, further blurring the line between what's real and what's imagined. As research in neuroscience continues to evolve, we may one day be able to directly visualize our thoughts and dreams through brain-computer interfaces. But with these advancements comes the risk of even greater manipulation of our sense of reality. In the end, as science, art, and technology continue to push the boundaries of what we know, one thing is clear. The way we experience reality will never be the same again. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember, reality is often just a matter of perspective. Thank you very much for watching and listening. Hope to see you. Goodbye.